thank you, Miguel, and thank you for our partnership at the U.S. Chamber. We very much value the longstanding, frankly, over a 100-year relationship that the U.S. Chamber has with the Puerto Rican Chamber. We couldn't ask for better partners there in Puerto Rico, and we're pleased to be joining you today for this important forum. I want to start with a little bit of background why, from the U.S. Chamber's perspective, parity in federal funding for Puerto Rico and across the states and territories is an important issue. And perhaps to set the stage, we can start with the importance of federal retirement and social safety net programs in the U.S. economy. We all know that today federal government spending makes up about 21% of our nation's overall gross domestic product. But when you begin to look at the component, and by the way, at 1/5, that means it's a pretty critical element of the economy. When you begin to break it down, however, and you focus on programs that are targeted to individuals from a broad population base, and you think about retirees and Social Security, Medicare benefits, and then you think for low-income individuals, Medicaid, the CHIP program for children, SNAP, for the disabled, SSI, for example. If you add all of those programs together, they're at about 11% of GDP. So how these programs operate both nationally and in places in our states and in places like Puerto Rico matter a great deal to the overall economic foundation. These are important programs, not just from an individual safety net standpoint, but an important foundational element of the economy. And as such, we tend to think about both the overall levels of spending for these programs and its effect on the economy and how funds are spent. And here we begin to think of the differentiation between those types of individual retirement and support programs versus other federal spending components. And we think about the different roles that in our federalist system, the federal government plays versus state governments. Generally, when we look at the economic impact of government programs, and we think about the bifurcation between the federal government and states, we think about them operating in unique spheres of influence. The states are, if you will, designed to compete. You know, the famous laboratories of democracy, as the Supreme Court has said. And the idea is that in certain spheres where states are paramount, they should design systems of government, programs, regulations, and laws that best meet their citizens' needs and in fact compete with the other states. And so whether it is tax policy and the differences between a California, which relies heavily on an income tax, and a Florida, which has no income tax, but relies heavily on sales tax, they've designed their economic systems to both be in competition and meet their state's citizens' individual needs. When we approach federal programs, we think about them very differently. The goal at the federal level is uniformity, that the benefits provided by the federal government don't differ whether you're in California or Florida or Oklahoma or Maine. And that's important for a whole host of reasons, both legal and constitutional reasons, which I know you're going to discuss later in this program, but also from an economic standpoint in terms of not forcing states or territories to compete on programs administered by the federal government. One of the things that it encourages is migration. If I'm a retiree, for example, and my Social Security benefits differ whether I'm in Pennsylvania or Florida, or whether I'm in Puerto Rico or Texas, all of a sudden that differentiation becomes a barrier to the free flow of individuals in our system. And one of the premises of federal programs is that the federal government shouldn't create artificial barriers between individuals moving between states. That was the whole purpose as they came together and replaces the Articles of Confederation with the new Constitution. But when the federal government's designing these types of programs, we also think it matters as to whether or not these are individual entitlements or block grants, which is really the heart of much of the discussion that we're having about these federal programs for Puerto Rico today. If you go all the way back to when many of these programs were first founded in the height of the Great Depression and the evolution into the Great Society into the 1960s, the premise was that most federal benefit programs would be individual entitlements for the very reasons that I just articulated a moment ago, that we don't want a benefit program to vary whether you are in Pennsylvania or Florida. In the 1960s, however, a discussion began to emerge about the concept of creating programs as block grants. And from the 1960s, really through the 1990s and early 2000s, the federal government used block grant programs for things that weren't tied to individuals and individual entitlements for things that were individually eligible, that's something an individual was entitled to receive for the important reasons that I discussed a moment ago. Interestingly, when this became a discussion about at the federal level about transferring some of these programs and reconfiguring them, one of the discussions was the barriers that would be created for individuals. And what we see today is exactly those type of fears playing out with this bifurcated system that we have now with respect to how we treat programs like SNAP, like Medicare supplemental programs, like Medicaid with Puerto Rico versus how we treat them in the States. That we've created a block grant type approach for Puerto Rico and an individual entitlement approach for the states. That creates very perverse incentives kind of across the spectrum. In one respect, it means that an individual's benefit that they might receive, for example, on SNAP will vary if they're in Puerto Rico versus if they're in the Commonwealth of Virginia. That's the very type of things we've been trying to avoid on the federal level. It ends up creating potentially migration incentives where an individual, when they're looking at their retirement, their health, or supplemental benefit programs, is actually encouraged to migrate from one state or one location to another. The exact thing that we want to avoid in the construct of any federal program. And frankly, we've seen that in Puerto Rico in the downturns and the natural disasters over the past several years, where individuals who, while in Puerto Rico as citizens, are entitled to a particular benefit, but get a much different benefit if they simply pick up and move to somewhere in the continental United States. And those differentiations create distortions in the system that ideally we're trying to avoid. The other problem it creates is that the way that the federal government funds programs with respect to Puerto Rico flies in the face of what we want to do economically. Many of the programs that you're talking about today, particularly the SNAP or food stamp program, are what we refer to as automatic stabilizers. They're a program that when the economy has a downturn, as we're currently experiencing, the spending goes up to meet the needs of a bigger group of recipients. That in an economic downturn, we have more individuals who need assistance, and those who need assistance need greater levels of assistance, and the programs automatically adjust to reflect that. When the economy improves and fewer people need assistance, and those who need assistance need less assistance, the programs come back down. And so these operate as stabilizers in the economy. The problem that we have today with the way the federal government has designed and treated these programs for Puerto Rico is that often when you have an economic downturn, you're still stuck with the same fixed amount. So the needs go up, the amount remains the same, and you actually miss the opportunity to help stabilize the economy in an economic downturn. No other state has experiences this. In the rest of the states, these programs operate to do exactly what they're designed to do, which is help citizens and states weather these ups and downs in the economy. And those are some of the problems that we create with this bifurcated system. Um, I want to end with drawing back to a bit of a history lesson that I think is instructive when we think about how the federal government has approached some of these programs in the past. And that's 1996's welfare reform. This was the first time that the federal government decided on a nationwide basis to convert what was an individual entitlement program where the funding wasn't constrained based on the geographic location of the recipient into a block grant program. And if you go back and you look at the debate, 25, almost 25 years ago now around that, one of the concerns that the proponents of federal welfare reform sought to, so one of the concerns that they had that they sought to fix in their design were the two problems that I just discussed. Creating perverse migration incentives where you have different benefits in different states and therefore disincentivizing or mistreating a citizen of one state compared to a citizen of another state. And the second was the loss of the automatic stabilizers to support the economy. And Congress at the time said, you know what, we're going to design this new welfare program to fix those benefits by requiring maintenance of effort requirements with federal money so that citizens of one state versus another weren't disincentivized and weren't treated differently. And secondly, providing buffers of increased spending during periods of economic downturn to maintain the economic stabilizing effects of the program. What we failed to do at the federal level with respect to many of these programs for Puerto Rico is incorporate anything that does the same thing. And so when we think about the economic opportunities in establishing parity with funding for Puerto Rico isn't just new funding that might be available for Puerto Rico and for the residents of Puerto Rico, but really achieving those kind of gold standards of design of federal programs, uniformity, and the ability to stabilize against economic downturns. That's the opportunity I think that these court cases present. It's the opportunity that some of the bills in Congress present. And it's the right policy, as we've learned over the last 25 years, if our goal is to, with respect to federal programs, create a baseline for which all American citizens can benefit, and from that enjoy the economic fruits that flow from that, while at the same time encouraging each state and encouraging Puerto Rico and our other territories to take advantage of the other factors that make them the unique places to be in their competition for business, for residents, for talent, and for ultimately economic growth. It's worked well in the 50 states. It's the right thing to do as we extend it to Puerto Rico. And that's why we're hopeful for this policy change to get enacted, and why we think it's not just going to be good for Puerto Rico, it's ultimately going to be good for the United States as a whole. I really appreciate you extending the invitation and allowing us to join you today and share our views about why parity is the right policy.